Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. My name is Sulla, and today we're going to do a slightly different look. We're going to switch from history and art and go to look at sociology. Now, hang in there with me. We're going to take a look at two fundamental topics in the production of mass movements: the mass movement itself and the true believer. So, what is a mass movement? It's actually a topic and a function which has been relatively recent in human history, and they come in mainly three flavors. Today, we don't really have religious mass movements so often anymore, but we do certainly still have social and national movements. Regardless of if it's a social revolution, a nationalist, or a religious movement, all of these have two basic characteristics. That is, a need to foster unity and a need to foster self-sacrifice. This generates a sense of a willingness to die and is paramount in the production of a fanatic and enthusiastic outlook on the mass movement itself. Above all, there is a demand for blind faith and single-heartedness towards that movement. Now, I use the phrase single-heartedness rather than single-mindedness. By the end of this short series, you'll be more than knowledgeable on why exactly that is. Now, regardless of the expected outcome of the movement itself, all of these rely on one single person. That person is the true believer. Without the true believer, the mass movement can get no ground whatsoever, and these social upheavals, national revolutions, and religious movements would be going nowhere. So, where does a true believer come from? A true believer starts out as a person who is frustrated. This isn't in a clinical sense, this is in a social sense. A frustrated person feels like they are wasted or less than what they should be, and as though they have no outlet to better themselves, or if they do, they reject these and instead want some other form of self-advancement. The concept of frustration is critically necessary to the mass movement itself. In fact, mass movements tend to facilitate a sense of frustration in the general air of wherever they're operating, in order to foster the development of more frustrated to become more true believers. We're going to take a little look at that just near the end of the series. There is one very important fact that we need to understand before we move forward with this. We're going to be using a lot of what you might consider to be religious wording or a religious vocabulary, but that's true in part. A lot of people believe that this is a time of irreligiousness, but this could not be further from the truth. To act religiously is to do something repeatedly, and a person who is religious tends to believe in the one and only truth. It's very funny that you can hear someone say something like, Christianity isn't an ideology, it is the truth. Islam isn't an ideology, it is the truth. Socialism isn't an ideology, it is the truth. Social justice is not an ideology, it is the truth. All of these display a deep sense of religiousness within the person making the statement. Just about all the people making such statements are, to be sure, the true believer themselves. The true believer in this day and age is in the streets, he is marching, he is an activist, he is forever on the hunt for the future and for a sense of fulfillment in social movements, in nationalist movements, and sparsely in religious movements. And as usual, which is the sort of focus of my channel, I'm not going to tell you which movements are necessarily good or bad. In fact, there really is no way to decide that other than on a personal basis yourself. The one thing that I do want to point out is that in itself, a mass movement is not a bad thing. It is a tool. Just like you can use a shovel to dig a ditch, you could also use it to kill someone. If you take a shovel and murder someone with it and then hold it there and say, this is a really bad tool, this just hurts people, you're acting silly. But, on the other hand, Just because that's not the intended function of the tool, it does not mean that it's not capable of doing so. So first, we're going to look at the conditions necessary for a mass movement to come about, and then we're going to look at the true believer himself. So, from whence does the mass movement spring? There are several factors. The first we'll discuss is a desire for change. Now, the desire for change is actually quite interesting because it's sort of a subsumed desire in that generally, when one desires for change, what they actually want is to change themselves. This is a frustrating concept, and the frustrated person decides that it is not himself who needs to change, but everything around him. Thoreau said, "A frustrated person who gains an ailment would seek not to fix that itself, even if it was just a stomach ache, but to fix the entire world." Now, it's quite interesting. The late 19th century, early 20th century was actually ripe for mass movements all across Europe, but for some reason most of these never even gained the slightest foothold in the American continent itself. The assassination of McKinley by a radical assassin was a small glimpse of the huge upheavals that were happening in Europe. So why did America experience relatively little desire for change within the population between 1865 and about 1950? Well, one good way to suppress mass movements is the ability to change your individual conditions and to better yourself. If you have a frustration and you want to improve yourself, and you can, then there's no need for a mass movement. When self-advancement isn't possible or isn't feasible, then radical change becomes a preoccupation. This means that people are no longer attempting to get a job and find a better life, to figure out what their fulfilling purpose in life is, to engage in creative works. Instead, they're taking to the streets, they're demanding change. Their center of attention has shifted from the present to the future, which is important. We're going to take a little bit of a look at that in a minute. Because American politics were marked by upheaval and constantly changing and adapting and allowing new and more expanded people to try their hand in the American game, the mass movements weren't as necessary. Mass movements of today, and by today I mean the last 200 years roughly, are usually social and national in conception, and they aren't so much an attempt to change the person themselves as they are an attempt to change a stagnant or old way of being. This inability to advance the self leads to a sense of discontent. Discontent by itself can be used to achieve self-fulfillment and some other ends, and it is not the primary goal of starting a mass movement. Discontent needs to foment into disaffection. Once we get to this stage, the person is no longer looking to themselves to change, to become more ready to accept the situation around them, and starts to take the opposite outlook. They now know that they need to change everything else except for themselves in order to achieve that self-fulfillment that their inner being so craves. This disaffection leads to a desire for power. The power that they wanted to change themselves becomes external. They no longer care about the change for the self. They now want the power to force everyone else to change. Generally, people are actually afraid of change. It's a very common idea. The people who aren't are the frustrated, and these are the people who you will see at the beginning of a mass movement. So there's an important concept I need to throw out there real quick, and this is Religio Fication, the taking of a practical purpose and turning it into a holy cause. This is something that is absolutely necessary to a mass movement, because if you say, hey, our society needs this patch, or it needs that fix, or something simple, then people aren't necessarily going to get behind it, because that reflects inwardly on them that there's a simple fix to this great discontent which they feel deep down inside of them. The disaffection requires a greater cause. It requires focusing not on the present, but something out in the future. Because of this, the practical purpose needs to be ensconced in a sense of religious indignity or righteousness. It is said that when communism took over the USSR, that this was a social revolution, this was an experiment in a new style of government, this was a really big thing, but in reality, the Russian landmass, which is roughly about a sixth of the Earth, and a lot of these smaller countries that got swept up in it were really attempting modernization, building factories, uplifting their people, increasing over time the ability to self-advance, but it was hidden behind this religious doctrine of communism and the far-off utopia, which was always just out of reach. This is true for just about all mass movements these days. The social movements, the religious movements, the national movements, they're all a sort of religious facade covering up some actual practical purpose. And because of this, the practical purpose itself can quite easily get obscured and thrown to the side once the discontented become the disaffected, and the frustrated are given a hope and a future which they can use to replace their current status of failure. So, who stands in opposition to the mass movement? That would be the self-fulfilled person. The person who, by their own means, made a fulfillment or a practical purpose in their own life. The self-fulfilled do not want change because they saw the way that they got that craving for their inner being, and they wish for other people to also reach out and use the same channels. To change what brought a person to fulfillment is the threat of taking away that fulfillment, and shows the inner frustration that could potentially be released by the self-fulfilled person. So one who is self-fulfilled or has a purpose is very focused on the present, on enjoying where they are now, and enjoying the opportunities and the abilities that they have at this second. A person in the present is much less likely to join one of these, and the opposite to this would be the frustrated person. The frustrated person cannot focus on the present, because in the present they are a failure, and they will not address this fact, because it's easier to focus on externalities and on something that doesn't have to do with anything that they can control. Therefore, the self-frustrated will look to radical change and a focus on the future. Because if they were to admit that their frustration originated in themselves, the need to change everything denies the need for change in oneself. So there's actually two groups that are very important to mass movements, and they both have the same origination and the same qualms. It's actually kind of interesting because they're people that you would normally assume to be opposites, but this really couldn't be further from the truth. The frustrated reject the present because of their failure, which they blame on everything around them. They blame the conditions, they blame the society, they blame anything that does not have to do with themselves. And because of this, they have what you could call a sort of luck worship, where they look to anything that doesn't have to do with them. They shun the present because they are unable to make anything meaningful in the present. And on the other hand, the inordinately successful, the person who has done everything right every time they've tried, also tends to see this sort of luck or chance as being much more important than the actual effort that they put in. So the person at the very top and the person at the very bottom both have this desire for change, because they both have this conviction which is held in externality. The people who tend to not favor change, on the other hand, aren't the old rich people, as you might think, but are actually the people in the middle who have carved out something of a purpose for themselves and who do not want to see that foundation shaken or destroyed. Alright, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. Like I said, this is a new series. We're going to be focusing on a couple topics in sociology. There's going to be 3 episodes to this piece, and then we're going to go in a little bit different direction again, trying to figure out what it is that everyone wants. But I think that this is really important because there are several mass movements that are swinging quite hard in our country today, and as Sun Tzu himself said, you can win 100 battles if you know yourself and if you know your enemy. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like. If you want more content like this, why not subscribe? But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.